So today I'll be talking a little bit about the home range and habitat associations of the spot-tailed earless lizards. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody really involved with this project. This presentation I'm doing for you today is sponsored in part by the TPWD Conservation License Plate funding, but we've been with this species for about 6 years, and there's lots of sources of funding, including Laughlin Air Force Base and the Comptroller's Office, as well as lots of people, as you can tell from our author line, to thank. So Wade and Toby are the co-PIs along with me, so they've helped things moving, and all our field techs who are out chasing these lizards. So Shelby, Jarrett, Dalton, Connor, and Timothy, we couldn't have done this without them. So I'll jump in with a little bit of, maybe. There we go. Okay. Can you guys see my pointer? Anybody?
Danielle?
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So the spot-tailed earless lizard, or Holbroochia lacerata, is a small rhinosomatic lizard. It was petitioned for federal listing under the Endangered Species Act in 2010 as Holbroochia lacerata with two subspecies, Holbroochia lacerata lacerata and Holbroochia lacerata subcaudalis. The listing decision is currently slated for fiscal year 2022, pending any changes. However, in the last 5 years or so, there's been some genetic and morphology work taking a deeper look at the phylogenetics of the species. And so Rolke et al. 2018 and Hibbets et al. 2019 went ahead and elevated the subspecies into their current species. So we have Holbroochia lacerata, or the plateau spot-tailed earless lizard, and that's range is here in green, so that's north of the Balcones escarpment. And Holbroochia subcaudalis, which is the Tamaulipan spot-tailed earless lizard, whose range is in South Texas, here in the red, and a little bit into northern Mexico. And so I will be talking about information from both these species today. So one of the problems with this species is that there hadn't been a lot of research on them. Ralph Axtell in the 60s and 70s, Mike Duran in the late 90s, 2000s. There's been some range-wide stuff, more recent stuff that we've been a part of in 2015 and 2017. We did range-wide surveys for both these species, and so Holbroochia lacerata on the left, Holbroochia subcaudalis on the right, and current records, so things that we've found within the last 5 or 10 years, are here in the dark, and historic records of the species are in this lighter gray. And again, you can see the Balcones escarpment splits the two species. And so Holbroochia lacerata has been found in 17 of the 20 counties it occurred in historically, so about a 40% decline. And then Holbroochia subcaudalis occurs only in 5 of the 21 counties that it's known from historically, so a much sharper decline. And you can see here that there are really two solid extant populations on the western and eastern side of their range, but most of they seem to have disappeared from the middle of their range. So in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been some research looking at changes to the habitat, some anthropogenic landscape alteration that may be impacting them. There's been the phylogenetic research. There's been a few natural history notes looking at predation and some of their behaviors. But today I'm going to talk more to you guys about more information from habitat associations and home ranges, so better understanding where these lizards are found in the landscape and the areas that they cover in their day-to-day needs. Let's see. So we have 2 study sites, one in Crockett County, which is this blue county here in Texas. This is the site where we captured Holbroochia lacerata, and you can see a snapshot of it on the left there. And this is a small but active oil field. You can see all the little oil and gas well pads, roads connecting them. And there's also ranching and grazing in this landscape as well. So some light grazing pressure through here. Let's see. Our other study site is in Valverde County. This is Holbrookia subcaudalis. Let's see. So you can see it's here in the blue, right on the border. This is Del Rio, and our site actually occurred on Laughlin Air Force Base. And so you can see it's an active airfield. It has 2 major runways that are used on a daily basis. And then it has this airfield that is mown on a regular basis. And there's some old airstrips that are pretty degraded. You can see through here. But this is a very highly managed area, but it's a pretty solid stronghold for this particular species. So during this project, we did surveys 2017 and 2018. We were out in the field surveying, mostly doing driving surveys, but also some walking surveys looking for the lizards. When we spotted them, we'd do our very best to capture them. And then we put a radio transmitter on them. And so this let us go out and track them once we had the radios on them. And we'd get out and track them about 3 times a day, usually morning, midday, and late afternoon. And once we get a fix on them, we'd try to get eyes on them and get a GPS point for them, as well as collecting some microhabitat data at each of the points. And we'll dive more into the microhabitat stuff later. So over the 2 years, we captured not a ton of lizards, but a fair amount in Crockett County for Lacerata. We had 14 lizards that we marked and were able to capture. 11 of those were adults and 3 of those were hatchlings. We only put radio transmitters on lizards that were about 44 millimeters or larger, so lizards where the transmitters were less than 5% of their body weight. In Valverde County for Holbrookia subcaudalis, we had a lot more lizards. So 23 lizards were marked, 22 of those were adults, and 1 was a hatchling. So of those adult lizards that we were radioed, 11 Lacerata were radioed, so all of our adults were large enough to be radioed, and 22 adults of subcaudalis. You'll notice the subcaudalis, the male-female sex ratio was even, so we had 11 males and 11 females. For Lacerata, our sex ratio was a little skewed. We had 7 females versus 4 males. And then to estimate home ranges, we needed a minimum of about 25 fixes, so 25 relocations for these lizards. And so when we get down to it, we only had 9 lizards with 25 fixes for Holbrookia lacerata, and 25 fixes for 11 lizards of Holbrookia subcaudalis. So some of the estimates we did here, I'm going to pop the numbers in a minute, but we estimated our home ranges in 4 different ways. So we used a minimum convex polygon, which essentially connects the dots on the outside of the polygon that we captured them from, and it's the minimum area that these lizards could traverse. We also did kernel density estimates. So we did both a 50% and a 95% kernel density estimate. So the 50% is generally considered the core home range, so where these lizards are spending about 50% of their time. And the 95% is going to be the larger area that they could potentially traverse. And then because movement data is autocorrelated both spatially and temporally, we did a 95% autocorrelated kernel density estimate as well for these guys. So just trying to correct for some of that autocorrelation and see how that impacts their movement in home range. We also looked at the percent overlap for the minimum convex polygon home ranges. to look at how much potential interaction these lizards may be having. So again, we have Holbroochia lacerata on the left, Holbroochia subcaudalis on the right. Remember 9 and 11 lizards. And so these numbers may not be very meaningful, and I'll show you some more numbers and some pictures in a minute. But these are in hectares. So one thing to notice is that MCP and all the KDs for Holbroochia subcaudalis are about 4 times larger than any for lacerata. So they have much larger home ranges or areas that they're traversing than did lacerata. These numbers are actually pretty large home ranges for lizards this size and even larger, more active lizards as well. And the other thing you'll notice is that Holbroochia lacerata had a fairly small amount of overlap in the home ranges, so only about 14% overlap on average, while Holbroochia subcaudalis on Laughlin Air Force Base had about 31% on average. So they had a much higher percent overlap. So here's a little bit of data to back up my claim that these are pretty large home ranges for lizards of this size. So this is a 2002 paper by Gad Perry and Theodore Garland that looked at lizard home ranges, so in meter squares, versus their snout bent length. And they looked at the effect of size. So we have males on the left, females on the right, body size, which is the snout bent length, diet, so insectivores, carnivores, herbivores, or omnivores, and the phylogeny, so Iguania or Argoglossus. So Holbroochia are Iguania, so they're filled in. They're insectivores, so they're diamonds, and I'll go ahead and pop them on the graphs. And so you can see that for lizards their size, so they average about 55 to 60 millimeters snout bent length, both lacerata and subcaudalis, although lacerata are a little bit smaller than subcaudalis. But you can see from the home range, from the dots I've put here, that their home ranges are approximately an order of magnitude larger than any other lizards that are their size, that have similar diets or similar habits. So it's not until you start getting towards lizards almost twice their size, so like 90 SPL or larger, that we see home ranges this large. So they're covering a fair amount of ground for such a little lizard. And so here's a close-up of some of the home ranges for Holbroochia lacerata up in Crockett County. And on the left, we have 2 male home ranges. So we have 102 and 103. And on the right, we do have 2 female home ranges. So while these 2 examples, the female home ranges are a lot smaller than the males, we actually didn't detect any real differences in the home range sizes, which is unusual for phinosomatid lizards. Most males tend to have a larger home range than females. That may be a factor of our small sample size, though, for this species. You'll notice, so the MCP are these colored areas. So these outline the areas that we captured them. So you'll notice they tend to abut roads, but all of the lizards we captured off roads, which may impact that. But you'll see they also spend a lot of time adjacent to roads in these habitats. A lot of the lizards had 2 or more core home ranges. So you'll see the 50% KDE is these, are these dotted lines. And so they'd spend some areas, a lot of time here, and then maybe move for a day, and then spend a lot of time in their second range, and potentially move back and forth between these. One note, just notice the scale for this one is about 220 meters. So this is about maybe 100 meters that this one's traversing, and maybe about 200 or 250 meters this one's traversing. When we compare that to Holbroochia subcaudalis, so again, we have 2 examples of males on the left, 2 examples of females on the right. Notice the scale bar is twice the size. So now we're at 500 meters. And so these are about twice as big of home ranges for the females, and males maybe even larger than the ones for Holbrookia lacerata. We see similar behavior between these two species, so note that they may be adjacent or running along these roads or these abandoned runways. We were restricted from these active runways, and so we weren't able to document whether or not they were getting on here, but it's likely they would. We see, again, multiple core home range areas, and you'll notice all these little numbers, so like 609, 607, 602, 612. Those are all our individual lizards in this area. And so we had a lot more overlap for these guys than we did for lacerata. So part of this may be that the habitat available in this landscape is so much more restricted. These guys maybe aren't as territorial as some other lizards, so they can balance some of this overlap. And we did have some observations of mate guarding, so maybe territoriality on a much smaller scale, essentially. So switching into microhabitat, because that's going to tie into some of these patterns we were seeing for the home ranges. You can see our little lizard here on the rock. And so every time we relocated a lizard, we would go ahead and get a GPS point. We try to disturb it as little as possible and get a GPS point at the first point that we saw it during that day. So sometimes you'd come up on it, you'd see it, and it would run away. And you could chase it if you wanted to get a picture or something like that. But generally, we tried to, we did our microhabitat measurements from the very first point we saw it. And so sometimes they sat very still and let us put our meter square frame around them. And sometimes they ran away. And so we got a GPS point at the midpoint. And then for our microhabitat, we estimated soil compaction, slope, and then percent cover all in the meter squared quadrat. So we had 5 different cover classes: grass, some forbs or woody vegetation, detritus. You can see these pieces of wood right here. These were considered detritus, along with like dead leaf cover. We had caliche, concrete, asphalt. These were all like road covers or well pads. So most of the roads in Crockett County for the oil and gas are caliche, so a hard clay-based soil. They're not gravel or concrete or asphalt. We also had this open category, so bare dirt, gravel, rocks, so what natural open cover, essentially. For Holbrookia lacerata, we ended up with 447 lizard points. So these were the points we considered used microhabitats. And for Holbrookia subcaudalis, we had 482 lizard points. So pretty close to the same amount. And then to compare what the lizards were using to what was actually available in the landscape, we put 13 and 11 transects across each study area, respectively, and estimated the same microhabitat covariates at 100-meter points across each transect. So that left us with 235 transect points in Crockett County and 220 transect points in Valverde County. So we consider this to be a survey of what the available habitat is out there. So we visualized this looking at non-metric multidimensional scaling, so NMDS plots. And so these take the different variables, so caliche cover, open cover, distance road, detritus, grass, slope, and it puts it in this multivariate space that lets us scale it. And so our lizard points are these open squares, you can see through here, and our transect points are these circles, and then they're in the space they're covered. For the lizard points are these dotted lines, for the transect points is the solid line. And so you'll see our x-axis compares high caliche cover, high open cover versus a larger distanced road and a higher grass and detritus cover. Our x-axis compares high caliche cover to low caliche cover. And so when you start looking at it just based on this plot, you see that the lizards were actually using a subset of the habitat that's actually available. And so when you start breaking it down, we found that they like things that were a little more compact. So they like microhabitats that were a little bit more compact in the lizard versus the transect points. They like things that had a lot more bare ground, so that open ground, rock, dirt habitats. They like things that had less grass. So these transect points tended to have more grass than our lizard points did, as well as less detritus. And then we also found that the lizards were significantly closer to the roads than our actual transect points, so they hung out next to the roads. But one interesting thing to note is that they're not using the caliche roads or wild pads more than you would expect. And so even though they're adjacent to roads, they're not necessarily on the roads all the time. And so to give you an idea of what this looks like in real space, we have two lizard points here. If you look really close, there's actually one of our lizards right there and another lizard right there. And so this just illustrates that they like some grass cover, but a lot of open ground. They like some road, but not really more than that's available. They tend to be adjacent to the road. Versus other areas that they could access, but they weren't. So we have these really highly dense grasslands. We had some shrubby areas that they were avoiding as well. When we look at Holbrookia subcaudalis, we see similar results. So again, this is just visualizing the lizard points in the open squares and the transect points in the closed circles. On this, we see the x-axis is now high asphalt cover versus high open. So that's that bare ground, dirt, rock cover, and high grass cover versus high asphalt cover. So you actually see in this one that the transect points form this really tight little area. So Laughlin is very highly regulated. It's very similar looking. And they were actually choosing areas that were, again, a little bit more compact, things that had more ground, rock, dirt, so this more open area. They were also choosing this asphalt concrete areas much higher than what was available for them. So they were sticking more to these open runways. And then again, using less grass than was generally available. So this is, again, illustrating what it looked like. So it's a little bit different. You still have these transect points that have high grass cover. This is common in the airfield where these lizards are found. But you also have these gravel roads, and then you have these old asphalt runways that have these veins of grass running through it. And so we found them really commonly on these runways, and they'd be sunning, they'd be out in the runways, and then when you approach, they'd run and dive into the cover of the grass. So to kind of summarize and recap everything, we found that these lizards, both species, had relatively large home ranges compared to both other Holbrookia species like Maculata or Propinqua, as well as other similarly sized herbivores. Those home ranges were particularly large. So again, 4 times as large for subcaudalis as Lacerata in Val Verde County, and that many of those home ranges paralleled or included roads and runways. So there may be some reasons that the home ranges in or subcaudalis were a lot larger. And so these lizards preferred these more compact and more open substrates. And it seemed like when the natural habitats, so that open bare ground, the dirt, the rocks were available, they would use those. But they used modified covers if that's what was available as well. So these asphalt runways, these gravel roads, those seem to be acceptable as well. And that lines up with some of the stuff that we've seen on our broader distribution surveys. So they seem to do okay in modified areas. So places with oil and gas, places with ranching, agriculture. So they tend to, they're often found along the side of agriculture fields. So they do like some cover, especially in terms of these grass clumps, but not too much. So this has some important implications for understanding threats to these populations. So for Hoperkia lacerata, one of the major threats is probably urbanization, which we can see on the eastern side of their range. So as these populations in these counties get larger, you see this transition from agriculture, from ranching, from these large open spaces to these more suburban and urban areas, which may impact their populations. For Hoperkia subcaudalis, remember we have these two populations, one on the eastern side and one on the western side of their historic range. And so while urbanization may be an issue, around Laughlin Air Force Base, here near Del Rio, or on the eastern side of the range, near coming up from Corpus Christi and surrounding areas, we also see in South Texas, there has historically been a lot of brush encroachment and invasive grasses over the last 100 years or so. And what that does, especially with the invasive grasses, is it clears up, or is it closes up all these open areas between the shrubs, between these wooded areas. So those open natural habitats that they tend to prefer are invaded by these big monocultures of invasive grasses, which may explain some of the losses, especially these heavy losses in the middle of their historic range. And these also lead us into some interesting ideas for mitigating threats to these populations. So obviously controlling invasive shrubs and grasses, this is a recommended conservation strategy for many lizards beyond Hoperkia lacerata, such as the Crotophytus, not Colaris, the other Crotophytus that lives in South Texas. We may also be able to open up some potential habitats or some corridors through habitat modification like mowing, disking, or grazing. And because these lizards make such large movements and have such large home ranges, there's a lot of potential for them to be able to move through these newly opened areas. And with that, I know this was kind of a short presentation, but I would definitely like to acknowledge again TPWD Conservation License Plate Program, which funded a lot of our work, as well as Laughlin Air Force Base for additional funding and access. I'd like to thank all our field techs again, and all our lizards who let us stock them for summers. And I will take any questions, I guess.
All right, this is Meredith Longoria, and I'm going to serve as the question person since I took over as host somehow. First question was, given the use of what are now roads and other human-driven development or modified areas, what can you say about the historical habitat needs or use of either species? Also, second part, what kinds of microhabitats would have likely been used prior to European settlement or even modern developments?
Right. So I think I would say that early successional habitats were probably likely. So one of the hypotheses I've heard before is that large grazers like buffalo or bison may have cleared areas for them to live in. Anything like that's opened up by fires, anything like that would probably be reasonable historical things that that they were using before these anthropogenic roads, well pads, other open areas. That helps.
Great, thanks. So there's one other question here, and I do want to open this up to folks unmuting yourselves and asking questions, or just type them into the bar and I'll read them. Either way works fine. And I appear as Bob Godfrey, the host, so apologize for that. The next question is, could I ask whether there might be a relationship between the larger home range size of subcaudalis relative to lacerata and the perception that subcaudalis has declined much more than lacerata?
That's a good question. I don't know for sure. I lean towards probably not. We've got a paper in review right now that actually characterizes a lot of the distribution surveys that we've done. And both walking and driving surveys are actually more effective for subcaudalis. So we captured a lot more, like all of the lizards that we caught for lacerata, we were caught off the road doing driving surveys. We didn't capture any of them walking. But walking for subcaudalis kicked up a bunch of them. I think while they do truly have some large home ranges, I think part of their extra large home ranges is due to the modified and controlled habitat on Laughlin Air Force Base. So I think their large home ranges do have some effect on our ability to detect them. But I would say the detection surveys that we performed during 2015 through 2017 were fairly extensive. And so there's no doubt populations we missed, but I think we've got a fairly good idea of where they are now.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question that came in is, how many young do they have in the season, and what's their survival rate, and how long are the lizards?
That's a good question. So we've come across clutches. So the three hatchlings that we caught appeared to be all from one clutch. They were in one similar area. I think they can have generally between 3 to 6-ish eggs. I don't know exactly how long these lizards live, but we think they're fairly short-lived, so probably 2 or 3 years. The survival rate for juveniles, we really have no idea of at this point. I think we've come across, Toby or Wade can jump in if they're here, but I think we've come across maybe 3 sets of hatchling, and we've not recaptured any of those. So, all
right, great, thank you. I haven't received any other questions, so I'd like to open it up to any other questions. Either type them into the chat message section or feel free to ask questions, please.
Sounds good.
Another question, could they be reestablished in appropriate habitat?
So that's a great question. That's one thing we've been thinking about, and one project we're working on designing is looking at potential translocations, or potentially doing some of the habitat modifications we proposed, like brush removal and opening up these habitats and seeing if the lizards will expand into there. So we suspect that there's some potential for that, especially because they seem to be fairly well adapted for these early successional areas. So, you know, these things that open up on the roadside and then overgrow quickly. We've, during the distributional surveys and previously with some of Ralph Axtell's work, showed that they appear to have these boom and bust population cycles where they can increase their population numbers pretty quickly and then just disappear for a couple years. And so all of that adds up to they would probably translocate, they would probably move fairly well. We just haven't done any of the work to show that yet.
All right, great, thank you. Are there any plans for a captive breeding program for either or both species?
None that I know of. If Paul knows, or if you know, Meredith, anybody else is able to jump in, but there's none that I know of yet.
I think that a few years ago, the Honorable Nathan Raines collected and took some to the Fort Worth Zoo for some kind of husbandry experiments to see if they could breed them and all this stuff. I don't know the details on how it all worked out. I think there were some nutritional complications, if I remember. If Nathan's online, he might be able to chime in with some more information. And if he's not, he won't. But yeah, that's what I know about that.
I did see a message come across from Toby Hibbett saying we have no idea on survival on juveniles or adults. Even in areas where we've captured fairly large numbers of lizards, we're finding almost no recaptures.
Yep.
Just wanted to note that.
Thanks, Toby.
Okay, one additional question came in, actually a couple. Would these species be good candidates for translocation from sites that will be impacted by development?
That's a good question. Potentially, I think with the urban, I really don't have a good answer for that. I would say potentially they would be a good translocation candidate. But specifically from those urban areas, I think it would depend on how recent that urbanization is and how dense the populations are still there. So that's a good question. I don't know, really.
Okay, another question is, can you identify the individual species visually?
Identify that, sorry, I missed part of that. Identify the individual species, which?
Visually, just by looking at them, can you tell them apart?
Generally, yes, if you have experience looking at them. So there's a couple of key characteristics. So the blotches here. So all of these lizards in the slide I have up right now are Holbrookia lacerata. And so they have these connected blotches on their legs. They tend to be a little bit smaller than Holbrookia subcaudalis. Part of it is just knowing where you are. So they're pretty firmly divided across the Balcones escarpment there. So if you're north of that, you've got lacerata. If you're south of that, you've got subcaudalis. Lacerata also, so these females here, you can see this bright orange and yellow coloration. So once they've mated and are gravid, they get this bright signaling coloration, and that happens a lot more often in lacerata than subcaudalis. There are very few of those lizards. So yes, there are some morphological differences. There's some we can't see, like number of femoral pores, and there's in Holbrookia subcaudalis, you have some of the side blotches that you see in other Holbrookia, like maculata, but we see those much less often in lacerata, like we have here.
Okay, thank you. And then Nathan Raines did chime in and say, yes, the Fort Worth Zoo has begun a captive breeding program with both subspecies or both species. Lacerata were all lost due to a calcium diet issue. Both lizards bred fairly easily in captivity, and were also fairly short leaves.
Thank you.
Okay, another question that came in is building on the translocation development question. Do you recommend survey methods for consultants to determine if a project area may have these species present?
Let's see. So we have found that driving surveys tend to be more effective for these lizards than walking surveys. They're very cryptic, hard to see. They're much easier to spot on roads, and they tend to thermoregulate at fairly high temperatures, so you can find them on roads most of the day, even in like the middle of the afternoon when it gets really warm. The other thing with that is they seem to be much less skittish if you approach them in a vehicle versus on foot. And so some of these lizards we were able to capture just by noosing them out the window of a vehicle instead of trying to run them down and chase them down and stress them out more. So definitely driving surveys. I know some of the consultants from BioWest were doing surveys on ATVs. I haven't heard how that worked. That would give you definitely more freedom of movement and you could cover more areas, but I haven't heard how the detectability for that is. I don't know if anyone on the line from BioWest who has any recommendations.
I haven't seen anything from a couple more questions that came in. One, if they're not easily startled by driving surveys, does that imply they may be vulnerable to being run over by vehicles on the roads?
So that is definitely a concern. So we had, for La Serrata, we had one female who was run over while we had a radio on her. We didn't actually see very many roadkills. We did have the one female, and then the next year we had one or two individuals who were indirectly run over in that they were under a rock that got smushed by a vehicle that got like run over by a vehicle and they got smushed that way. I think we've had one or two roadkills at Laughlin Air Force Base, but there's a lot of traffic on those roads. So they actually maybe are less vulnerable than you would think at first. And I think part of that goes back to the kind of the stuff we were seeing with the home ranges and microhabitat, in that while they do use the roads, they tend to use the areas next to the roads a little bit more often. So even though they like that open space, they still prefer some cover. And so I think, yes, death on the roads is a threat, but I think it's mitigated a lot by their habits, and how they're using the roads.
Okay, great, thanks. Another question was, do you see them showing up as observations on iNaturalist?
They do, I think, regularly appear as observations on iNaturalist. I think they mostly appear in areas that we know them from, although more recently we've had one or two observations in more urban areas where we thought they were maybe less common or extirpated from, like around Fredericksburg. We had an observation on iNaturalist from a parking lot. So there are some interesting things happening there, in that iNaturalist lets us get these random observations and gets a lot more people out and active and looking for them. So yeah, we do see them fairly regularly pop up.